Something unusual has started happening between Canada and Washington, and this time, it doesn't feel like the usual political theater. For years, the relationship between the United States and Canada was treated almost like background noise in global politics. Stable, predictable, quiet. Most people assumed the alliance would simply continue forever without serious tension, but behind closed doors, that assumption has been slowly breaking apart. And now, with one speech, one policy direction, and one very carefully delivered message, Mark Carney may have just changed the entire tone of the relationship. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way Washington immediately understood. Because what happened was not just about trade. It was not just about military spending. And it was definitely not just about diplomacy. What made this moment different was the timing. The world is entering a period of uncertainty that feels larger than anything seen in decades. Europe is under pressure. NATO is becoming increasingly nervous about its future direction. China is expanding influence faster than many Western analysts expected. Global supply chains are shifting. Energy politics are becoming more aggressive. And quietly, countries that once depended heavily on the United States are starting to ask a difficult question behind the scenes. What happens if America no longer wants to carry the entire system alone? That question changes everything. And Canada may now be positioning itself for a future few people are openly discussing yet. Because when Carney spoke recently about economic sovereignty, strategic independence, and the need for Canada to secure its own long-term resilience, many people initially thought it sounded like ordinary political language. But in Washington, some officials reportedly viewed it very differently. They heard a warning, not hostile, not direct, but unmistakable. A signal that Canada may no longer be comfortable remaining fully inside America's shadow the way it once was. And what makes this more interesting is that the shift did not appear overnight. In fact, the signs have been building quietly for years. Few people noticed how often Canadian officials began discussing domestic manufacturing security after the pandemic. Few people paid attention when conversations around defense cooperation became more cautious. Few noticed Canada slowly increasing conversations with European allies independent of Washington's leadership structure. At first, these looked like isolated developments. Now they are beginning to look connected. Because global politics has changed dramatically since the world entered this new era of instability, the old assumptions no longer feel guaranteed. And countries like Canada understand that better than most. Geographically, Canada sits next to the most powerful nation on Earth. Economically, its future has long been deeply connected to the United States. Militarily, it has relied heavily on American protection structures for generations. But dependence creates vulnerability. And vulnerability becomes dangerous when the world starts becoming unpredictable. That is exactly why some analysts believe Ottawa has quietly started preparing for a future where strategic flexibility matters more than loyalty alone. The timing is important. Over the last several years, Washington's global focus has become increasingly divided. The United States is dealing with rising tensions in the Pacific, growing pressure from China, instability in Europe, domestic political polarization, economic concerns, and growing questions about its own long-term direction. Meanwhile, allies around the world are watching carefully. Not because they want America to weaken, but because uncertainty forces governments to think differently. And this is where Carney enters the story. Unlike many traditional politicians, Carney's background gives him a very different view of how global systems operate. Before entering frontline Canadian politics, he spent years inside the world of international finance and central banking. He saw firsthand how fragile global systems can become when trust starts breaking down, which means he understands something many politicians ignore. Economic power and geopolitical power are now deeply connected. That changes how countries think. A nation that cannot secure supply chains becomes vulnerable. A nation too dependent on foreign manufacturing becomes vulnerable. A nation without energy leverage becomes vulnerable. And perhaps most importantly, a nation that relies too heavily on another country's political stability also becomes vulnerable. This may explain why Carney's recent language sounded unusually sharp beneath the surface. Publicly, the message appeared measured. But strategically, it carried enormous implications. Because when Canadian leadership begins talking about protecting national independence during a period of global fragmentation, Washington understands exactly what that means. It means Ottawa is preparing options. And few things make superpowers more uncomfortable than allies preparing alternatives, especially when those allies have historically been among the closest partners imaginable. What happened next surprised many people. Almost immediately after Carney's remarks, political analysts in both Canada and the United States began debating whether a deeper realignment was quietly beginning. Some dismissed the idea completely. Others argued the comments were being exaggerated. But behind the scenes, officials reportedly understood the broader context. This was not just rhetoric. This was about positioning, because Canada now faces enormous pressure from multiple directions at once. The United States wants stronger alignment against China. Europe wants deeper cooperation on energy and industrial security. Global markets are demanding more stable supply networks. And Canadian voters themselves are increasingly worried about affordability, economic resilience, and long-term national stability. Balancing all of that is becoming extremely difficult, especially when the global system itself appears increasingly unstable. And this is where the real tension begins. For decades, Canada benefited enormously from remaining closely aligned with Washington. The relationship created security, trade access, investment flows, and political predictability. But there is another side to close alliances. Over time, they can limit strategic independence. Quietly, some Canadian policymakers have started asking whether the country became too economically tied to decisions made in Washington. That conversation used to be considered politically risky. Now it is becoming more mainstream, particularly after recent global crises exposed how quickly international systems can fracture under pressure. The pandemic changed perceptions. The war in Europe changed perceptions. Supply chain collapses changed perceptions. Energy disruptions changed perceptions. And now governments everywhere are reassessing vulnerabilities they once ignored, Canada included, which may explain why Carney's tone felt so different. It was not emotional. It was calculated, almost surgical. The kind of language designed not for headlines, but for governments paying attention behind closed doors. And Washington absolutely noticed. Because from America's perspective, maintaining unity among Western allies is becoming increasingly critical as global competition intensifies. The last thing U.S. strategists want right now is uncertainty among key partners near America's own borders, especially not Canada. That is what makes this situation potentially much larger than it first appeared. This is not simply about two neighboring countries disagreeing. This may be the early stages of a broader shift happening across the Western alliance itself. A quiet recalculation, a slow repositioning, a realization that the post-Cold War world many governments depended on may no longer exist in the same form. And if that realization spreads further, the geopolitical consequences could become enormous. Because once allies begin prioritizing flexibility over dependency, the structure of global power starts changing in ways that are very difficult to reverse. What makes the entire situation even more sensitive is the economic backdrop surrounding it. Canada's economy is deeply exposed to American markets. Entire industries depend on U.S. trade access. Millions of jobs are connected directly or indirectly to cross-border economic cooperation, which means any serious political tension carries enormous risk. Carney knows this. Washington knows this. And that may be exactly why the messaging has become so carefully controlled. No one wants open confrontation. But increasingly, it feels like both sides are sending signals without saying everything publicly. Signals about leverage, signals about future positioning, signals about what kind of world may be coming next. And quietly, behind the headlines, global investors are paying attention too. Because when close allies begin subtly redefining their relationship during a period of global instability, markets notice immediately. Investors understand something ordinary political coverage often misses. Political trust is one of the foundations of economic stability. Once uncertainty enters the equation, everything becomes more fragile. Trade, currencies, energy cooperation, defense agreements, supply networks, all of it. And perhaps that is why this story suddenly feels much bigger than Canada alone. Because what's happening here may actually reflect a much larger fear spreading across the Western world right now. A fear that the old system is becoming harder to hold together. And if that's true, then Carney's message to Washington may not have been the beginning of the problem. It may simply be the first visible sign that the problem already exists. What made Washington especially uncomfortable was not what Mark Carney said publicly. It was what his message implied privately. Because underneath the careful diplomatic wording was a much deeper idea beginning to emerge inside Canada's political and economic circles. The belief that the world is entering a dangerous transition period where even close allies may eventually be forced to protect themselves first. And historically, moments like that tend to change global politics very quickly. Few people openly talk about it, but major alliances are strongest during periods of stability. When economies grow, security threats feel manageable, and markets remain predictable, cooperation comes naturally. But uncertainty changes political behavior. Fear changes political behavior. Economic pressure changes political behavior. And suddenly, countries begin asking questions they avoided for decades. Questions about dependence. Questions about leverage. Questions about survival. That may sound dramatic, but behind the scenes, many governments are already preparing for scenarios that would have seemed almost impossible only a few years ago. Trade fragmentation, energy nationalism, supply chain wars, currency instability, technological separation between global blocs, even the possibility of weakened Western unity. And if those fears continue growing, countries like Canada face a difficult reality. They can no longer afford to assume the future will automatically resemble the past. That is why Carney's recent posture matters so much. Because unlike traditional nationalist politicians who use emotional rhetoric, Carney approaches geopolitics through systems, economics, and long-term risk management. His language sounds calm, technical even, but that calmness may actually make the message more powerful. Because when someone like Carney starts emphasizing resilience, sovereignty, and strategic flexibility, global institutions listen carefully. They know he chooses words very deliberately. And quietly, many analysts believe Canada may now be entering the early stages of a much broader repositioning strategy. Not against America. That part is important. This is not about Canada becoming hostile toward Washington. It is about Canada becoming less willing to depend entirely on Washington's future stability. And there is a difference between those two things. A very important difference, because one creates conflict. The other creates distance, sometimes slow distance, sometimes invisible distance. But distance nonetheless. The signs are already beginning to appear in places most people are not paying attention to. Take energy politics. For decades, Canada's energy relationship with the United States functioned almost automatically. Canadian resources flowed south. American markets absorbed them. The system felt permanent. Now that certainty is starting to fade, Europe's energy crisis completely changed how governments think about resource security. Suddenly, countries everywhere realized something dangerous. Dependence can become a geopolitical weapon. That realization shook Western capitals more deeply than many politicians admitted publicly. And Canada noticed. Quietly, discussions around Canadian energy exports, infrastructure expansion, and alternative strategic partnerships started becoming more serious. European governments began looking at Canada differently, not just as a neighbor of America, but as an independent source of stability. That changes Ottawa's leverage. It also changes Washington's calculations. Because if Canada develops broader strategic options internationally, America's influence naturally becomes slightly weaker over time. Again, not dramatically, not overnight. But geopolitics rarely changes overnight. It shifts slowly until suddenly everyone realizes the balance already moved. And what makes this moment even more sensitive is America's own internal situation. The United States is entering one of the most politically divided periods in modern memory. Elections are becoming increasingly tense. Public trust in institutions has weakened. Economic anxiety continues spreading through large parts of the population. Meanwhile, globally, America is carrying enormous pressure. China continues expanding technologically and economically. Russia remains a long-term security concern for NATO. Conflicts in multiple regions continue draining political focus. Debt concerns are growing, and many U.S. allies are quietly wondering whether Washington's attention span can realistically handle every global crisis at once. That uncertainty matters, because allies respond to uncertainty by increasing flexibility. Exactly what Canada now appears to be doing. Some analysts believe Carney understands something that many politicians avoid saying openly. The next decade may force middle powers like Canada to become far more independent than they were during the post-Cold War era. And if that is true, Canada cannot simply remain passive. It must prepare economically, prepare politically, prepare strategically, even prepare psychologically. Because the global order that protected smaller Western nations for decades is beginning to look less stable than before. What happened next raised even more questions. Shortly after Carney's comments gained international attention, discussions around Canada's industrial policy intensified dramatically. Suddenly, terms like economic resilience, strategic industries, and domestic capability started appearing more frequently in political conversations. That may sound technical, but underneath those phrases is a much bigger story. Countries preparing for uncertain futures often start by strengthening internal systems first. Manufacturing, energy, technology, defense production, food security, critical minerals, artificial intelligence infrastructure, semiconductor partnerships. These are not random policy areas. They are the building blocks of geopolitical independence, and Canada happens to possess enormous advantages in several of them, especially critical minerals. Quietly, global powers are increasingly competing for access to resources necessary for batteries, military systems, advanced electronics, and future technologies. Canada sits on significant reserves many countries desperately want access to. That gives Ottawa leverage it may not have fully exercised before. Washington understands this very well, which is partly why recent developments are being watched so carefully inside American strategic circles. Because the United States cannot afford strategic uncertainty near its own borders during a period of growing global rivalry. Not economically, not militarily, not politically, and perhaps most importantly, not symbolically. Because if Canada begins demonstrating more independent geopolitical behavior, other allied nations may feel more comfortable doing the same. That possibility creates serious long-term implications for Western unity, especially as Europe itself becomes increasingly nervous about future American political direction. Few people noticed how much European rhetoric changed after recent global crises. Publicly, leaders continue emphasizing alliance strength. But privately, many governments have started preparing backup strategies, strategic autonomy, independent defense planning, regional industrial cooperation, alternative supply chain frameworks. All of these conversations are growing quietly beneath the surface. Canada appears to be moving in a similar direction, not abandoning alliances, but reducing vulnerability inside those alliances. And that subtle distinction may define global politics over the next decade, because the era of unquestioned dependence may be ending. What makes this especially complicated is that Washington itself helped create this environment unintentionally. Over the last several years, America increasingly used economic power as a geopolitical tool: sanctions, export controls, trade pressure, technology restrictions. These policies were often aimed at rivals like China or Russia. But allies learned something important while watching it happen. They learned how powerful dependence can make another country. And once governments understand that lesson, they start thinking differently forever. This may explain why Carney's message felt so carefully constructed. He was not threatening Washington. He was reminding Washington that Canada has its own national interests too. Interests that may not always perfectly align with American priorities in the future. That idea alone represents a major psychological shift. Because for generations, Canada largely defined its strategic role through partnership with the United States. Now the conversation may be slowly evolving towards something more independent, more flexible, more cautious, and potentially far more consequential than people currently realize, especially if economic conditions continue deteriorating globally. Because historically, periods of financial instability tend to accelerate geopolitical realignments. Governments under pressure become less ideological and more pragmatic. Survival becomes more important than tradition, and nations begin quietly repositioning before crises fully emerge. Some believe that is exactly what Canada is doing now: positioning early, preparing quietly, building optionality before larger global fractures appear. If true, that would explain why Carney's tone sounded so measured yet so significant at the same time. Measured enough to avoid panic, significant enough that Washington immediately recognized the deeper meaning. And behind closed doors, there may already be growing concern about where all of this eventually leads. Because once allies begin psychologically preparing for a less stable future, it becomes very difficult to return to the old assumptions again. Trust changes. Expectations change. Strategic planning changes. Even the language between governments changes. And quietly, beneath the surface, something about the Canada-US relationship now feels different than it did before. More cautious, more transactional, less automatic. As if both sides suddenly understand the world entering the next decade may be far more dangerous than the world they grew comfortable living in. And if that feeling continues spreading across the Western alliance, then Carney's message to Washington may eventually be remembered as one of the first public signals that a much larger geopolitical transition had already begun.